This is the second module from the first week in March. Uh, um, and in this discussion, I want to uh, walk through the Declaration of Independence and kind of connect to what has gone before in terms of our discussion of cropsey, and then also to set up how it connects with the main issues that we'll be discussing tonight and through the rest of this week in the consideration of the founding and Storing's book on the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So again, from cropsey, we see what the elements of the regime of the United States are. This interesting tension between the document, the parchment regime, the official regime, which itself represents a certain frozen point in modernity, and then the subsequent unfolding of the regime, which tends to reflect the inner debate and subsequent debate and self-criticism of different waves of thought as the presumptions of modernity unfold and become absolutized or radicalized, together with this kind of downward or vulgarization or popularization of these ideas, and the sort of notion that the way these concepts originally unfold have a kind of inspiriting or strengthening, but then by the time that they kind of represent their popularization and vulgarization, there's a kind of a loosening or an indulgence to them. So again, the purpose of that article was to kind of set the content and unfolding of American political thought against the larger background of modern political philosophy that produced the core concepts of a nation and may explain, let's leave it as it may, its subsequent and future unfolding. So what I want to do today is then raise the question, if you're looking at the notes that I sent out, um, uh, cropsey supplies the philosophic genesis and unfolding. But then, as we're going to see what we're going to be doing this week, and to connect this from the discussion last week, and again, this discussion of the declaration that I want to do today is really about uh, um, seeing the main implications and effect of the declaration itself as a platform for American politics and American political thought. Um, and in particular, since we're turning to the founding and the founding period, and, and then that first initial great debate that we encountered as an independent nation, what sort of institutions should our republican life consist of, and the great debate over the Constitution, um, I just want to suggest in this discussion that besides this panoply of modern thought that cropsey puts in front of us, what other aspects of the founding have an effect on the unfolding and nature of our political rhetoric and our politics. And from the Declaration, you'll see I'm going to suggest that the Declaration's place and effect is what I would call rhetorical or ideational. Um, the Declaration contains several critical concepts that frame that found and frame American political life. They are the ideational or conceptual basis of American life, and of course, as Cropsey points out, the core ideas of the Declaration point backwards and forwards to the larger field of modern political philosophy, which produced those concepts and ideas. But after all, I mean, even if you grant Cropsey's point that waves of subsequent philosophic thought waft over humanity and waft down and then affect the popular understanding, and then affect the emergence and development of the parchment regime, um, the language and the ideas of the Declaration have their own, if you will, potency because in American life, because they are our documents. The ideas are not particular to us, but they become ours by virtue of being included in our document. And when I say the rhetorical framing, um, all political, and this is in my American government class. This is the sort of beginning point why we start with the Declaration. Is all subsequent political debate in America turns on the interpretation of the concept of equality and liberty and rights. So all American politics occurs within a framework of rhetoric of equality, rights, and liberty. And so what I want to do is again examine some of the implications and the tensions inherent in the set of ideas and the language that frames our political life. And from so aside from this rhetorical or ideational aspect of the Declaration and its centrality at the beginning of the country and unfolding, I would say that what we'll encounter in our discussion of storing and the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and between the supporters of the Articles of Confederation, our original Constitution, and the Constitution, our second Constitution, of course, our guiding Constitution, is what I would call structural aspects. We're going to see when we turn to the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debate, all Americans were advocates of what one could call popular government or uh, or Republican government. Those aren't identical terms, and in some ways, paying attention to the debate between the framers, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, makes you aware of the nuances within that shared universe of thought. And when we turn to the Storing's book tonight and the rest of the week, one of the things we'll be trying to do is to see what these two great parties had in common, and of course, what separated and differentiated them, and why one set of those one set of ideas of those combatants became victorious and set the core tone for American life. But as you're going to see, Storing argues that the losing side has also contributed, and we'll be exploring the somewhat ironic character of what he means by that, and why it's necessary to recover that original debate. So, if you're looking at the notes, there are three enduring themes that sort of dog American life and are reflected in many of the specific issues historically and even in contemporary politics that come from this great debate that we'll be examining. And those structural influencers of the structural tensions, I summarize them in three broad categories: populism versus institutionalism, commerce versus, and I've invented a word, agriculturalism, and the enduring tension and dynamic between centralization and nationalization versus localism and state sovereignty or semi-sovereignty. Let me just say what those are, and then of course we'll be exploring those themes this week and in some ways beyond. Populism versus institutionalism. Populism means, in some ways, that is identical to the term popular government. The idea that all authority derives directly or indirectly from the people. And by the way, that's Madison's definition of what a Republican form of government is in Federalist 39, where all power of government derives directly or indirectly from the people. Now, the moment that you say that, directly or indirectly, you already get the discussion of different kinds of popular government and orientations of popular government that you find, say, adumbrated and sketched out in Federalist 10, where Madison suggests that the genus of popular government has two species: democracy and republics. Democracy with direct, where the people directly control the government, or public opinion in its raw form determines governmental policy, and then a republic in which the people rule through elected representatives. And we again, those trip off our tongues lightly, but it turns out there's real tension between those two things. And you could say that in some ways neither the Federalists nor the Anti-Federalists were Democrats, in the sense that both argued for some kind of institutional representation as the basis of good government. But then what I want you to hear is the tension then, and how, and we'll see how this works out subsequently in American life. And I'll give a quick contemporary example. Um, so populism, and when somebody's called a populist, and the notion of populism means that that's an attempt to actually make as many of the operations of government derive directly from the direct influence of the people, whether it's like a New England town meeting, as we'll see that de Tocqueville examines as a sort of the first emergence of the genuine American community. Um, but understand then that you now I want you to see the tension between those things, because institutionalism, or an institutionalist, suggests that good policy, uh, you'll see that institutionalism is a critique of populism. And this is more or less what Madison lays out in Federalist 10, that, and we'll see, this really was both Again, I said earlier in it that both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were both advocates of Republican government, which is to say representative government. But it will be fair to say to see the Anti-Federalists as wanting to move the needle point of representational or institutional authority closer to the popular origins. And so an institutionalist argues that good policy, and in fact, the authority for policy, is not so much whether it's rooted in popular will. Don't forget, all going back to the Declaration, as we'll see, all legitimate governmental authority or system of government, a legitimate system of government, a legitimate regime, according to the ideas of the Declaration, um, rests in the consent of the governed. But but that in the Declaration, as you're going to see, primarily operates on the level of the choice of system of government, as um, as many participants in American debates in American politics, Lincoln say, you could argue that it doesn't matter what system of government you choose as long as it's consented to, and that may be as far as the Declaration goes. The debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists takes this one step further now. And again, both advocated that the form of government that the American people should choose is some kind of Republican government. But again, an institutionalist would argue the institutionalist critique of populism as the source of ongoing governmental policy, popular opinion, is that popular opinion, the will of the people, is actually raw, like a raw energy or a raw substance that is actually not useful and can be harmful on the grounds that, as Madison points out in Federalist 10, and this will be a subject that we'll examine thoroughly, both in the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and certainly in de Tocqueville, that the people can do stupid things. That the people don't have a direct experience of the needs of government. They have an experience of their own private lives, and that the people can want something unjust. Again, one of the things, the primary issue that we're going to be examining, the issues of the primary lens in this course I've suggested from the beginning that we're going to be looking at the issues of American politics is the lens of race. Well, what's called white supremacy is actually what Madison would call, and what de Tocqueville would call, is a form of majority oppression. It's majority rule turned into an oppressive thing. At least that's one way of understanding what comes to be called, say, white supremacy. So the argument is, for good policy, for any government to be good, its authority and its policy formation has to be produced by institutional processes that have their own authority, constitutional authority. Now, to be sure, the governing institutions of our Constitution do regularly consult the will of the people in the form of elections. But the premise of Republican government is Republican government institutional authority doesn't operate by public opinion polling, although we have moved in that direction, and public opinion polling, as it plays out in our contemporary political culture, poses interesting issues and problems. But to see in contemporary politics this tension between populism and institutionalism, look at the way the 2016 and the 2020 nomination processes were framed, both on the left by Bernie Sanders, especially in 2016, and to some degree in 2020 during the nomination process, and by Donald Trump on the right side. Both in the 2016 election, both Trump and Sanders used the language that the nomination process was rigged. And in particular, Sanders meant that in the Democratic Party, the reservation of the role of superdelegates, uh, activists and party leaders who, after the populist phase of primary elections, where in today's electoral system, candidates have to generate popular followings in order to be nominated. Very quickly after this system came into being in the 60s and 70s, it's not that old, by the way we nominate our candidates for office, especially the presidency, through popular primaries. Um, the great shift in our politics in the nominating stage has been away from institutionalist mechanisms where party leaders and organizations would essentially do the nomination stage to a populist one where now we have popular primaries. And so that means if you want to be a candidate, you don't have to appeal to the institutional elites, you have to appeal to the popular base. Now, that's a complicated question and has all kinds of implications for the way our politics is done and the way it's headed. But Um, but again, the reason that both Bernie Sanders and Trump on the opposite sides of the political spectrum called this process, they were making what you could call populist appeals, and they were trying to undermine the authority of institutional arguments. But my point here is that as you'll see when we unpack the founding debate, that this tension between more and more direct appeals to popular authority, the direct will of the people, and appeals that derive from institutional processes and authorities, um, uh, that's endemic in our politics and has played out many different ways in different circumstances. The second kind of structural issue from the framing that we'll see between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists is sort of like an embrace. It's an economic question. What's the best way for a Republican government where the people genuinely do control the spirit of the government? What kind of economic way of life and arrangement of the economy is best? And you'll see this original debate sort of between agriculturalism, the embrace of the life of, and we were an agricultural nation, and in some ways the alternative is what you could call commerce or even industrialization. Now, Britain at that time was just beginning to industrialize, and we ourselves were just beginning to develop our own manufacturers. The great voice, the great opponents on this were, of course, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who argued that the life of urbanization and commercialization and banking and industrialization would create like urban proletariats, and ultimately would create a way of life which doesn't sustain genuine popular government or a Republican way of life. Now, of course, you'll see, of course, as Hamilton pointed out, and if you've seen the musical Hamilton, part of the issue is yes, you had Jefferson, this agrarian, somewhat the anti-federalist, arguing for the rule of the yeomanry farmer class. But of course, Jefferson was also a slave owner, and the people who tended to make that argument, not all, tend to also embrace some kind of plantation slavery. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the arguments for agriculturalism and for an agricultural way of life as the preferable one, or a rural way of life, were always bound up with slavery, but they were. In some ways, it was ironic that the leading spokesman for the agriculturalism or the rural way of life as the preferable arrangement for republicanism was, in fact, a slave owner and represented the slave owning class. And that was to some degree part of the issue in the unfolding of the country in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s was between wage capitalist labor in the North and the organic kind of um, plantation and agricultural life of the South. That did become a kind of an issue between the North and the South. That that still plays out in our politics to some degree, although, as you'll see, our contemporary embrace of those issues, the lines between a commercial way of life and banking versus the kind of rural way of life have kind of faded, if only because most of agricultural today is not done by small family farms, it's done by massive industrial conglomerates, although there's still family farms out there. But people do advocate this kind of small town agricultural way of life as being more consistent with um, uh, being rooted in genuine human needs. Again, more about this later. And then last, the tension between you could call centralization and nationalization versus localism and even state sovereignty or semi-sovereignty. This is the great tension that was at the heart primarily of the choice between the Constitution and the Articles, as we'll see. And anyway, so all three of these kinds of structural tensions that emerge between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, we'll be exploring them at the time of the founding, and then, as of course, as we look at de Tocqueville and other issues through contemporary life, we'll see how they played out. So let's spend the rest of our time examining the Declaration of Independence. And what I want to do is just highlight some of its language and then have a running commentary. So the question I want to raise is how does the Declaration structure and influence our political debate and our political life? As I said above, it provides the essential rhetoric of American politics and political debate, and American politics is a debate about the meaning of those core ideas: rights, equality, and freedom. So much of American politics depends upon how Americans understand the core language and concept of this document and how they try to make their life unfold from it. So let's just begin with the second paragraph. Most of what we're going to be talking about is, and I appended the way I discussed this in my American government class. I have a nice outline of the Declaration, which I've included in the notes, and you can look at the PRQs for the Declaration. Most of what we're going to concentrate on today is the second paragraph. So let's begin with that second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In my American government class, I point out the fact that Jefferson changed the original draft of the Declaration from "we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable" to "we hold these truths to be self-evident." And in my American government class, I trace the origin of this language of self-evidence to the field of mathematics and geometry, which is where it came from. The idea being that a self-evident truth is an initial form of rationality, so whose terms are so simple and clear that even a child can understand them. And in my American government class, for those of you that had me for American government, remember I used the distinction between the quadratic formula, which is not a self-evident truth, although it's a mathematical truth, and 2 plus 2 equals 4. So um, what do we learn from this? This points to the fact that American politics is an example of this broad terrestrialization or secularization that Cropsey spoke of in the modern world that begins with um, uh, Machiavelli. Um, and again, in terms of the development of our politics, um, especially the generation after Machiavelli in the 1600s, the great Enlightenment philosophers such as Hobbes, Spinoza, and Locke, who formulated the whole notion of rights. Now, the self-evident part means that the core aspects of our nature that are politically relevant are grounded in our visible natures, and that a human being employing the simplest terms of human rationality can see the truth of propositions that follow, by the way, in the rest of this paragraph. And one other thing about that is this language of self-evidence also points to the understanding that our political principles that form our nation are not true by virtue of being held in a kind of creedal authority that we, like a creedal statement, like a creedal statements in Christianity say, which are held to be fundamental terms of Christian belief, which are evident and available only to those who profess the Christian effusion of faith. So here, the suggestion is the core American beliefs, because they are self-evidently available to human beings as human beings, that there is an implicit universalism to them. Um, and that's reflected in the third verb of the first paragraph, in which we're going to dissolve in the first paragraph declaration, that we'll dissolve the political bands. We will um, assume the status of a sovereign nation, and a decent respect for the opinions of mankind compels us to declare the causes, to declare and explain the causes of the American Revolution. To whom? To mankind, on the grounds that the principles of the American Revolution are visible to and intelligible to the entirety of the human race when freed from ignorance and prejudice. That more or less is the language of the founders, and that points to a certain tension in our life, because we're going to see government comes from the consent of the governed, of the people that enter into that initial compact. What makes us Americans is that we created America and American government, as you'll see, for the purposes of securing our rights. But don't all human beings have rights? Yes. But as we're going to see, that's a tension. And what kind of an issue does this tension between universalism and that is to say, rights embedded in human beings, and the fact that the American government derives its power from those rights, but then exists primarily to secure the rights of Americans? The whole question of the border and immigration reflects this tension, because you could say that in some ways, the argument for loosening restrictions on immigration, even legal restrictions, has to do with the fact that people who want to come to this country are trying to reclaim their rights. And doesn't the American government exist to secure the rights of human beings? Yes, but the other side would say, fine, everybody has rights, but the only rights that the American government are bound to respect are the rights of the individuals, the Americans who created the system of government to secure their rights. So, and that tension between, you could call it the national government existing for the purposes of the nation versus the national government securing the rights of human beings, that's a tension that's also, by the way, reflected in our foreign policy, um, which goes back very to the beginning of the Republic, whether or not our foreign policy, for instance, has to be conducted differently from the kind of balance of power and the self-interest of nations, or whether or not we have to do our foreign policy according to a universal standard of morality. That tension is still playing out in our politics today. So we move on to the next and critical statement of the second paragraph of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, all human beings are created equal. This highlights the central place of equality and the attempt to flesh out the meaning of equality in American national life. Now, we discover, and by the way, the next phrase, which we'll turn to, of course, is that they are endowed. The second thing you learn, aside from human beings being equal, is that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And so these three words, rights, equality, and freedom, the way that I teach them both in modern political philosophy is they emerge in Hobbes's thought and are taken up by subsequent political philosophers, as Kropsky points out. Um, um, but even just as they exist as poles of attention and tension in American politics, um, uh, equality and freedom are the two sides of the coin of rights. So it turns out when you say human beings have rights, you are saying two subsidiary truths about them that are automatically implicated in the possession of rights, as human rights. You're saying that human beings are equal and human beings are free, liberty, freedom. And so, again, those two rhetorical anchors uh, ground about 99.9% of all issues in American politics. Um, Now, the relationship between these two concepts becomes a major theme, and in fact exists right now in the sort of tension between free speech on the one hand and say the equal dignity of individuals. That's the debate that's going on in our campuses right now and in our media and to some degree in our politics. Um, so anyway, to go on, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, when we discuss this in American government, and if you've had modern political philosophy, you know that the triad of rights that Locke speaks of, who formulates them for our tradition, are life, liberty, and property. Um, Property is the equipment of life that a free individual exercising natural and equal liberty uses to preserve his or her life. So the life, liberty, property exist in derivative sequence from each other. Our initial need is to remain alive. In order to remain alive in a state of equal nature before the rise of politics, where we're all equal, all equally free, and that freedom means we choose the means to stay alive. Our liberty consists of choosing and deliberating on the means to stay alive, and in particular, that means acquiring the equipment of life, which is property. Now, that triad still exists in the Constitution in the Fifth Amendment and in the 14th Amendment, and and again, the relative place of private property and the sanctity of private property, those are ideas and limitations on them that the debate over which echo through our whole history. But what I want to do here, and this is in the second page of the notes from today, from this lecture, is to uh, look at some broad implications about what this language means. What's the view of human life here? And it would be fair to say that in some ways this is what is often called in social science a rational egoism, or an economic model of man as a maximizer. Like when you enter into the free market as a consumer and you're trying to choose between car A and car B, there is a certain sense in which this is the very model of human life. We need to stay alive. We want to stay alive. And what we do as we move through life is deliberate on the means by which we think we can best remain alive. And so, again, that's not unlike the image of consumer economic rationality. Um, and the next kind of question is rights means that you're entitled to certain things. A right is an entitlement. Well, where do these entitlements come from according to the Declaration? They come from our nature. Nature implants the needs that are the basis of these entitlements. And roughly, when you look at human beings, this is where equality comes in. You can say, well, okay, some people are brilliant, and some people are good looking, and some people have exquisite taste. Some people are fast, and some people are fat, and there are all kinds of natural differences. But the needs to remain alive and to be free and to have property, you could say, are equal, because the core needs of human life, as nature makes us. Uh, I might have an inordinate need for chocolate, which may dwarf yours, but that's not per se a natural need. A natural need is the need to stay alive through, say, nutrition. And basically, all human beings are similar. They're a species in this, and so there is a kind of a substantive notion of equality. But the way this plays out in our languages is, but because we're basically equal in our needs, and our needs have equal dignity, and that even King George is no different from you in that he has to go to the bathroom and eat just like you. Um, Although he probably has nicer toilet paper than you. Um, but the argument is we are entitled to these needs because the needs are implanted in our nature. Nature grants the entitlement, and as you're going to see, that means that we constantly, both in our personal lives, guided by this notion that we seek our rights, and in our political life, we constantly are engaged in the debate between the nature of needs and wants. Um, am I entitled to everything I need? Am I entitled to everything I want? And you're going to see that there is a certain tense, and this is reflected in the kind of differences of opinion about the environment of Republican government that Republican government provides for people. You could say that, okay, children don't uh, um, experience the distinction between needs and wants, but as you grow older and you can reflect on the nature of your life and long range versus short range need, you come to understand that adult life um, uh, requires the distinction between needs and wants. And that's at the heart not only of remaining alive and healthy as an adult, it's at the heart of having children um, itself. Because if you can't distinguish as an adult and you have children, and you can't distinguish between needs and wants, then you're probably setting yourself up to be a terrible parent. So, but again, as you'll see, especially as modern science develops, as Cropsey suggests, and the conditions of human life get transformed by science so that nature is more and more capable of yielding up the things we need and want, it's likely that in a system of government and society formed on these ideas, the difficulty of holding on to the distinction between needs and wants. And I would say, for instance, that's involved in all kinds of things like the debate over minimum wage or even the debate over health care. But it is an issue that constantly surfaces in our life, both, and I would say both personal and political and social life. Um, and the implication here, by the way, and this begins to shape how we think about what politics is and what the government is for, as you'll see, is the suggestion is nature makes us pretty complete before the emergence of society. According to this view, if you've had ancient political philosophy, you know that Plato and Aristotle, for instance, argued that by nature we are constructed to be political beings. But the Declaration says no, we are not naturally political, we're naturally independent. We form politics, as you'll see, and this leads to a whole set of other considerations. We create politics, we create government because our needs are insecure. And therefore, as you're going to see, um, this this implication is that living in politics and society where now our individual good has to compete with our common good, you'll see that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are both quite aware of the fact that to see a human being as possessing and seeking rights means, and to make the argument that we create government as an artificial acquisition to help us secure our rights, we are not naturally inclined to pay attention to or want the common good. And that tension between wanting what's good for you, because the principles say you're entitled to what's good for you, but because we also need the collectivity as an instrument to obtaining our individual goods, you can see this eternal tension between doing what's good for you and what's good for your country. So much so that in Kennedy's famous inaugural address, he asked Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, Ask what you can do for your country. That goes completely against the tenor of the Declaration. And it means that at the heart of American life, and by the way, some people would say that was reflected in the issues of the pandemic, that Americans are just so self-centered and so attached to their own liberty that they didn't want to do the collective things necessary to stop or arrest the pandemic or so I'm not taking a stand on any of those controversial issues. Believe me, there are policy issues on both sides, but you can see how the tension exists in our very principles, and indeed that tension emerges in our national lives. Um, now, there's another critical issue here too. What are the moral implications for a moral human way of life and a moral communal way of life? Do we have obligations to other people by nature? Now, the formulator of the concept of rights, Thomas Hobbes, was an absolutist. He says, no, we are not obligated to do anything. And that means if you're in the jungle and you're a mother and you're carrying your child and you get hungry and there's no food around, do you have the natural right to eat your child? Or are you morally obligated as a mother to preserve that child? Well, the thrust of nature is that you eat your child to preserve your right to stay alive. Now, that's a very raw and extreme example, but there is a certain sense in which that question, where do the obligations to each other come from? The Declaration's suggestion is the obligations are socially derived from and imposed upon us by the creation of society and government. More about that later, of course. To continue with the language of the Declaration, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. When government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish. Prudence suggests the latter, not too often, but mankind are more disposed to suffer bad government, even though when government goes bad and is destructive of rights rather than fulfilling its end of securing rights, they have the right to abolish or alter it. So again, note this, what's the status of political life in general? It's a lowering of politics to a level of instrumentality. Politics is an instrument to our individual goods. The collective exists for the sake of the individual. Now, that leads to another interesting question embedded in these principles. We say that we have these rights by nature, and nature creates them complete and full. Yet they are insecure by nature, because after we learn that we have rights, the next sentence in the Declaration is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers. So the reason that government is created is because the rights that are complete and whole by nature in our natural condition, are insecure. We have them, but we can't enjoy them. Now, why not? Why are our rights insecure? And it turns out that there are various possible answers to that. And those various possible answers, and you'll see that they fall into three groups, are, naturally kind of shape the political alternatives that American politics coughs up. So when Hobbes is talking about the insecurity of our rights and the necessity of forming government, and Locke to some degree too, and even Rousseau, we form government because we are a threat to each other. The main threat to our rights comes from other people asserting their rights. And since there's no government in our natural condition, government is an instrument created by human beings. Since we have no government over us, we're all in it for ourselves. It's the jungle. And again, if you read Hobbes' Leviathan, Hobbes is very uh, blunt about the nature of our natural condition. He says in chapter 13, and therefore the life of man in the condition of nature is solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Um, sort of like a fraternity party gone bad. Um, but 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 that means, in other words, that other human beings are the primary threat. And there's no question about that. By the way, when I teach this in American government, I ask students, if your car breaks down on I-26 at 3 in the morning and you see headlights coming, uh, your first impulse is not necessarily, oh boy, I'm safe, but oh my God, I wish I had a gun or a mace or something. And Hobbes says we get used to other people in society, but down deep we really don't trust others because we know they want what we have and we want what they have, and therefore there's this. He says our natural condition is a state of bellum omnia contra omnes, a state of war of all against all. So what's the solution? Peace, and that means erecting a common form of rule. Now that you can say that's the minimalist understanding of why our rights are insecure, and that leads to the minimalist understanding of what the purpose of government is in our tradition, which is generally what people call libertarian. Um, and libertarians say we don't want the welfare state, we don't want abortion regulations, we don't want drug regulations. The only purpose of government is to provide police, army, and courts to courts to and laws for that matter to draw property lines, police to make sure that your neighbor doesn't jump over your fence and steal your television, and courts to kind of uh, um, uh, flesh out the conflicts between people, and armies to protect us against the hordes of invading Canadians. Um, so uh, beyond that, though, there's an awareness and I would say this is the kind of mainstream consensus of our politics and parties, that the threat, and I think both the Democratic and Republican parties today, even though we're in this period of intense polarization, both really embrace this broad consensus that it's not just other human beings that provide the threats and insecurity to your rights. It's also nature overall. That in the very fabric of nature are the kind of threats in the form of like chance, earthquakes, catastrophes, natural disasters. The state of the I-95 in New Jersey, no, that's not a natural disaster, but plagues, pandemics, um, and even chance, like you losing your job or getting your leg cut off or something. So within the kind of mainstream consensus of America is an awareness that nature itself, and therefore this is clearly a more expansive role of government. That the purpose of government is to offer like flood insurance, or FEMA, or even Social Security against the instabilities of old age. Now, in the widest perspective, you'd have to say we also recognize uh, that we ourselves can be a threat to our own rights. Not just because I have a niece who committed suicide, although Hobbes discusses suicide in Leviathan and says that nobody has a right to suicide because you only have a right to life, you can't have a right to death. That's become articulated in our politics, in our culture in different ways. But this leads to what I would call sometimes cultural liberalism and cultural conservatism. Conservatives argue, for instance, that human beings need moral legislation to protect them against their own bad habits, like drugs and pornography, for instance. Um, Today's liberals and progressives argue that we are our own worst enemy because of the possession of prejudices and ignorances and racism, say, and therefore government has to step up and reshape human beings to sort of lessen our own defective qualities. Seatbelt regulations are an attempt to protect us against ourselves. So when you look at the three potential sources of insecurity of our rights, that explains why there's so many different answers to the purpose of what it means for government to secure our rights. Does that mean that the government owes us old age pensions? Does it mean that the government owes us subsidies in the pandemic? Does it mean that government has the right to tell us we can't smoke or use marijuana, or at least provide college lectures while under the influence of marijuana? Just kidding. Anyway, so um, you'll see those tensions are inherent in American life and often lead to intense partisan battles about what government is for, because the different answers to what government is for are pegged to how our rights are insecure by nature, which therefore need the correction of government. And some concluding reflections on the Declaration that I think will come both in our consideration of the founding this week as we look at the tension between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, but really as they unfold in American life and to some degree tap into the unfolding of modern thought that Cropsey links American political development to. The two things I want to focus on are the problematic relationship between equality and freedom. The core concept in the Declaration is rights. This makes two statements about human beings. One, that they are, as I've said earlier, equal, and two, that they are free. Are these two concepts identical? Are they in tension? These two concepts especially link American life with the rest of modern thought and politics, as we've seen with Cropsey, etc. Their individual and connected understandings determine much of the content of American life and politics in general. So, for instance, equality of life, does that include fetuses? Equality of liberty, does that include an equal right of woman to terminate a fetus's life? The moment you actually start uh, looking at specific issues in American life, you see that these two concepts, they can't be separated from each other, and yet they exist in tension. And as you're going to see, uh, the question will arise is which, even though these two concepts are necessary and in tension, the great debate in American politics often is which is more fundamental and which has to give way to which. De Tocqueville, as you'll see, is the great chronicler of that issue. The second big issue that resurfaces both at the founding, as we'll see in the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and throughout American life, is the relative downplaying of public life with respect to private life. Government exists to secure our rights, more specifically, to secure my rights. This suggests our identities and loyalties form in the private realm, prior to or outside of government. Government and the public assumes an instrumental function. That is to say, government is an instrument which we create to secure our individual needs. Easy to say, but then playing out in practice is difficult. So, why should we pay attention to government? Well, it's what we need to for our good. And therefore, in the same way that, like if you have a car, which is an instrument to your private mobility and convenience, it's in your interest to keep it in tune and to keep it in good repair, because if you don't, it will cease to be of instrumental value to you. That kind of is how Americans have a tendency to view the political world. And again, this is a great departure from the understanding of politics that dominated in human life up until 1776 and the practical embodiment of the Enlightenment. Politics in the prior ages was the purpose of politics was to prepare the soul for the afterlife, to make sure that the right revelation was enforced, to make sure that imperial glory of the nation, like in Rome, every Roman was lifted by the glory of the nation, and therefore any Roman wanted to imperial conquest because that's how you establish the glory of the empire. So all those goals of the improvement of the soul, the afterlife, the correct revelation, the glory of the prince in the nation, or the rule of the superior human beings and therefore virtue. It all takes that's all sloughed off. Now the question is can you really have that? After all, what happens when the nation goes to war? Hobbes even said in the Leviathan that you have a right to run away from battle if your life is threatened. Well, try to fashion an army. Could we have defeated the Nazis if that was everyone's thought? So, as you're going to see, um, this suggests a tension and a constant and eternal tension in our political life that we constantly have to struggle against the simple privatization of our lives. We have to force ourselves to pay attention to the political world. And as we see, this is the link to the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debate. It took much of its energy and direction from this issue. And as we shall see, de Tocqueville thought that this was perhaps the most dangerous long-term tendency of the American democratic regime, for Americans to lapse into their own private little worlds of trivial self-interest, while the Republican character of their political universe drifts apart and or they are overtaken by powers outside the nation.